Greetings, my fellow freedom lovers and sovereign thinkers. Thank you for tuning in to the LO3 Podcast. My name is Craig, transmitting from the beautiful swampy mangrove, South Florida. And today's date is Saturday, January 25th, 2020. Let's go open a few things out. Watch some of the impeachment hearings, or trials, whatever you want to call it. And I love when all the social media experts come out and just shoot their mouths. But it's okay to have an unconstitutional impeachment trial, right? The impeachment proceedings and all that is all null and void. But it's okay to folks to ignore the Constitution because they can't stand one person. Pretty unidimensional and stagnant indeed. The bottom line is this: the Senate has sole power of the trial. No ends, ifs, or buts. I'm trying to take the initiative on looking at the impeachment managers. And it's funny because I didn't see any origins. And it looks like it started what I got during the Clinton's impeachment. So it doesn't matter what party. I hear all this, well, the Republicans done it. Who the hell cares? When it comes to the U.S. Constitution, it has to be honored with no exceptions. Not just mixing it around, saying, oh, they've done it before, all these political factions are nothing more than her conformist. I'm like just looking through here, see the side I want to talk about. When I was on the phone, it looks like there's 34 injured in their missile attack in Iran. So it's supposed to be an investigation according to Defense 1. Yeah, I'm outside right now in the park along the New River, Fort Lauderdale. Beautiful day. Might do laundry later on tonight. Probably later on after the show. So without further ado, only talking a couple things. Four things here. Narrate a couple stories. 4 stories, I would say. 2 from Defense 1. 1 from Mises. Other ones from CNS News, conservative news site, which they're pretty good too. They got some good articles in there also. So I take the initiative on checking it out. And this one here came out defense1.com, and it's entitled "America Has Come Full Circle in the Middle East." This is by Uri Friedman. Came out today, by the way. In 1958, U.S. leaders stood at the threshold of American era in the Middle East, conflicted about whether it was worth the trouble to usher in. A year earlier, in the context of the emerging Cold War and fading British and French power in the region, Dwight Eisenhower has articulated and received congressional approval for what became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. The United States have for the first time staked out national interest in the Middle East. Oil, U.S. bases and allies, Soviet containment, and declared that it was prepared to defend them with military force. 62 years before President Trump dispatched a drone in Baghdad to kill Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, this is how American combat missions in the post-World War II Middle East began. Eisenhower felt compelled to issue his doctrine following a showdown over the nationalization of the Suez Canal by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, an Arab nationalist whom U.S. officials perceived as allied with the Soviet Union. The U.S. president had pledged to honor requests for American military assistance by countries facing aggression from components of international communism. Yes, we can say an empire. The U.S. commitment was tested when insurrectionist Iraqi army officers executed their country's last king, the Western-friendly Faisal II in Baghdad in the summer of 1958. Camille Kalmoun, the Christian leader of Lebanon and the opponent of Nasser, asked for American aid against the backdrop of a coup in Iraq and looming civil war in his own country. The revolution in Iraq had little connection to Nasser, but the U.S. didn't initially grasp that. In keeping with the grand domino theorizing of that period, U.S. officials worried that they didn't act decisively. U.S. partners such as Lebanon and Jordan would be the next to fall to Nasserite nationalism and, by extension, Soviet communism. Eisenhower hastily convened a meeting with his top national security advisors on the day of the Iraqi king's downfall. John Foster Dulles, a consummate Cold Warrior and the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, argued that a failure to heed Calhoun's call would signal to the Soviets that the United States wasn't ready to take risk for its allies, and would thus mean the decline and indeed the elimination of our influence from Indonesia to Morocco. In a calculation that has been turned on its head today, the President maintained that to lose this area by inaction would be far more worse than the loss in China, basic of strategic position and resources of the Middle East. His team insisted that the U.S. was sound footing to intercede militarily in another country's civil war, because Lebanon's president had invited them in a poignant point to read today as Iraqi officials seek to kick the U.S. military out of the country in retaliation for Soleimani's killing. As for intervening in Iraq as well, Eisenhower celebrated World War II general who was typically cautious about taking military action dismissed the notion as unworkable. An illustration of how how new all this was to Americans, Eisenhower's speech announcing the operation included a geography lesson, knowing that Lebanon was a small country, a little less than the size of Connecticut, and that Iraq was nearby. He was also mindful of the risk. I realize we're opening a Pandora's box here, a jumpy Eisenhower told Britain's equally nervous prime minister on the eve of deploying the Marines to Lebanon. The episode and its aftermath are essential to understanding how the United States went from being deeply apprehensive getting involved militarily in the Middle East to conducting more military interventions there in any other region in the world. The trajectory of U.S. involvement is one of American leaders gradually putting stock in their ability to achieve their objectives. Though discrete military action and then investing everything in costly military misadventures to the point that we've come full circle. The American public and its leaders are profoundly ambivalent about even limited and critical missions, such as campaigning against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Even in 1958, now familiar patterns of military intervention in the Middle East were evident, though he advocated a troop deployment to Lebanon. For example, Dulles warned that the United States was entering a situation in which it would be easy to get ourselves involved and very hard to get out. Then, as now, military inaction was equated with the United States renouncing its interest in the region. We must act in Lebanon or get out of the Middle East entirely. Eisenhower told his aides, presenting a stark choice that Trump is surely acquainted with. Then, as now, the White House debated whether it needed congressional authorization for its combat operations. Then, as now, U.S. leaders offered the public misleading justification for the use of force. Eisenhower greatly inflated the situation in Lebanon to be about avoiding another world war by refusing to appease the Soviet Union, when it mostly had to do with internal Lebanese politics. Despite Eisenhower's soaring rhetoric, the U.S. objective was narrow in scope, to prop up a friendly government, and that goal was achieved with surprising ease. Dulles had predicted that the military intervention would generate blowback, such as an oil crisis as Egypt and its ally Syria retaliated against commercial infrastructure, or a wave of anti-Western feeling in the Arab world. Yet, when hundreds of U.S. Marines came ashore in Beirut on July 15, 1958, backed up by 3 aircraft carriers and a dozen of warships in the Mediterranean Sea, plus the threat of the U.S. deploying nuclear weapons from Germany, they were greeted merely by sunbathers and vendors on the beach. U.S. diplomats soon negotiated a political settlement that eased Común out of power. American forces, eventually numbering in the thousands, left the country in October after suffering only one fatality from a sniper fire during a 3-month deployment. They got in easily, they stabilized the situation, and they got out easily. Well, half a century later, the future of the United States' military presence in the Middle East is once again up for discussion, as Iraq calls on the U.S. to end its roughly 5,000 strong troop presence in the country, and Trump struggles to remove American forces from Syria and Afghanistan as well. U.S. politicians are now grappling with the possibility of a post-American period in the region. Though Eisenhower and his advisors could have known it at the time, their swift, successful operation would prove that exception rather than rule. Subsequent American combat missions in the Middle East would not be so lucky or so cost-free. Bruce Riddell, a Middle East expert at Brookings Institution, has written, "The wars in Iraq have now seemingly become endless." In the years following the campaign in Lebanon, Iran underwent an Islamic revolution. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. A violent Sunni Islamist movement rose up. All seismic developments that encouraged the United States to double down on its investments in the Middle East. By the 80s, Washington had created a combatant command for a greater region and unveiled the Carter Doctrine to defend Persian Gulf partners. The U.S. came to view Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq as its top threat after the Soviet Union collapsed, and George H.W. Bush carefully collaborated multinational military operations to reserve Iraq's 1990 invasion of Kuwait, arguably represent the height of U.S. military competence in the Middle East. In the space of a decade and 2 Bush presidencies, however, the United States veered into a major debacle in Iraq. James Jeffries, now Trump's special representative for Syria, noted in a 2016 study after the September 11 attacks, George W. Bush decided not to manage the challenges to U.S. interests in the region, as his predecessors had done for the past 3 decades, but to try to eliminate those challenges altogether. Though its post-9/11 wars in Afghanistan, especially Iraq, the Bush administration attempted not only to root out hostile regimes, but also to fundamentally remake the region in a manner consistent with U.S. interests and values. Foreign influences over there, you have to see that as well. Bush, of course, failed in spectacular function to achieve that transformation. Barack Obama, who ran for president in part to remedy those failures, mostly maintained America's security architecture in the region and sought, largely unsuccessful. And that is true. To overhaul America's role in the Middle East without resorting to military force. Trump, by contrast, has been willing to use limited military force, but has also demonstrated little interest in effecting any change in the region beyond retiring the United States as a security guarantor. Ultimately, he wants out. And even if Trump don't get his way entirely, he will undoubtedly seize on additional opportunities to reduce the American military presence in the Middle East. As fed up Americans and progressive presidential candidates push in the same direction, when Eisenhower elected to open up that Pandora's box in 1958, his justification was that it would be disastrous if we don't. Perhaps nothing signals the coming post-American era in the Middle East more than the fact that so many U.S. leaders these days fear the disastrous consequences of leaving the box open. Interesting history lesson when it comes to foreign policy. Blowback can affect everybody. That's why the founding fathers always believe in no foreign entanglements. Plus, align with none, trade with all. Things do occur even way back when. But why make it a burden for everyone else, even if their young brothers and sisters are serving? It's to defend the United States, not foreign interest, etc. A lot of these wars have been unconstitutional or illegal wars. Talked about that in my past episode, but Congress has the power to declare war. They still want to use the same excuse. Oh, gotta go do using war resolutions. No, that's totally invalid and completely irrelevant. These authorizations have to stop, as far as I'm concerned, because empires hurts a lot of beautiful people, regardless of which side they're on. Yeah, so this next one here, same site, defense1.com. The case of repealing and not replacing the Iraq War Authorization is by Elizabeth Beavers. Came out this morning. We are very recently almost found ourselves in a new war with Iran. As part of its continued response to that crisis, the House of Representatives is planning to vote on a repeal of the Iraq War Authorization. These two things may seem totally unrelated, but the Trump administration's reckless Soleimani assassination is actually the perfect example of why Congress can no longer afford to put off repealing and not replacing this long outdated law. Here's why. To be clear, the resolution on the chopping block is the 2002 Authorization for the Use of the Military Force, or AUMF. It was enacted by Congress to approve a disastrous war choice, invading Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and since been used to justify unrelated and unauthorized military activity. Most recently, it was cited by the Trump administration amidst its flurry of contradictory rationales for the Soleimani strike. It's legally laughable that this authority could cover a drone strike against an Iranian official in 2020, but this episode makes it clear a dangerous reality. If the authorization remains in the books, it will continue to be used. Indeed, the Soleimani assassination was not just a reckless and dangerous escalation. It was the exact outcome that advocates of repeal have been long working to prevent. While this moment rightfully became an opportunity to mobilize against a new war, it must next lead to a long overdue reckoning. For nearly 2 decades, Congress has allowed the expansive war authority to remain on the books, ripe for exploitation in a conflict-prone executive. What it was once a persistent warning alarm should be now blaring like an emergency siren. Repeal of the Iraq War Authorization must become a top priority in order to prevent future similar crises. Frustratingly, it was barely a month ago that Congress actually had a prime opportunity to do just that. The House version of the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, on a bipartisan basis, adopted a provision led by Representative Barbara Lee to do away with the 2002 Iraq authorization. And I'll tell you one thing, I don't even like the woman, because she is a globalist stooge. But this here, I'll give her some kudos, all right? It should have been and wasn't controversial. Repeal is also popular among the public. Hundreds of people from all over the country assembled in Washington, D.C. this fall as part of the Friends Committee on National Legislation annual gatherings in support of repeal. It's not just one example of many. Letters have been sent, phone calls have been made, and events have been organized, but at the last minute the provision was stripped from the bill. The recent brush with new Iran war shows why it's so important for Congress to act boldly for repeal. This is not an academic exercise or a simple matter of getting paperwork in order. It is not just a process for the sake of process. There are real consequences and lives at stake. Congress's power to authorize force and accountability to the voters, for now they wage that authority. is supposed to serve as an extra step between the whim of the executive and potentially deadly results. Potentially deadly results. It is a matter of functioning democracy. I hate when they use that term. Good grief, these people, man. I just like to smack them beside their head. Excuse me. Functioning democracy to ensure that these checks and balances are in place. Indefinite authorization like the Iraq War, AUMF, let Congress off the hook and put war on autopilot. See, Congress has the power to say no. Enough is enough. It should be the top priority for Congress to correct its historic blunder of passing the buck when it comes to war and peace. After all, those who voted for the Iraq War authorization in the first place have been haunted by their choices years later. Consistently across the ideological spectrum, the Iraq War is widely reviled and politically toxic. So too, should those who decline to finally repeal that authority fear both the political and human consequences of their continued failure to act. It's time for Congress to follow the lead of advocates by not stopping until its authorization, which has caused so much suffering and will continue to do so until it is gone, takes its rightful place in the dustbin of history. Remember, Congress has the power to declare war. Don't give the president any more authorization. Started since 1941, of course, during the Franklin Roosevelt era. And it went a little bit further. And it got accelerated but right during that time of the 20th century. AUMF has been used a couple of times, even with Jefferson, with the Barbary pirates in North Africa. Because they were like taking the seizing goods and using the sailors as ransom. But the bottom line, especially with this scenario, Congress has the power to declare war. No excuses, no end ifs or buts. I support common defense, not imperial offense. That's how you gotta look at it. We shouldn't go around attacking other countries on our dime. Form of extortion, as far as I'm concerned. Bring all of our troops home. This is a good start. I do commend it. All right, cool. So this one here came from Mises.org, the Mises Institute. Secession in Virginia would defuse the state's conflict over guns. Came out yesterday afternoon. And that's what Ryan McMacken has to say about this. Earlier this month, the West Virginia State Senator Charles Trump introduced a Senate resolution requesting that the citizens of Frederick County consider joining West Virginia. That is, the West Virginia Senate invited the county to secede from Virginia and join West Virginia. Yep, you hear some music in the background. Radio-friendly stuff, I would say. Yeah, so let the thing pass by. Yep. The Senate later adopted the resolution. Resolutions like these don't change any laws, but the Senate vote was part of a response to the satisfaction voiced by some Virginians over the legislative agenda on the new government in Richmond. As though Bishop noted on Monday here at Mises.org, many residents of Frederick County, like residents of other counties outside the Democratic-controlled areas of the state east and northeast, are considered about mounting efforts by the state government to impose new gun ownership restrictions, among other new regulations, on Virginia residents, which is all null and void under Article 1 of the Commonwealth Constitution. I did a show on it. You can check it out. Self-explanatory. If opponents of the current ideological winds blowing in Virginia find themselves in a permanent minority, it may be very well be that the only method of defending the minority position is by leaving the state. But exit can theoretically be obtained in more than one way. It can be done on an individual basis, of course, where a single person relocates, or it can be done through jurisdictional secession. In the case of Virginia, there will be nothing novel about some parts of the state breaking off from the Richmond-controlled government. The same thing happened during and after the American Civil War. At the time, the Mountain South was less inclined to support slavery and more inclined to be Unionist than plantation areas. That was true for mountain areas of Virginia as well. Northern politicians took advantage of this split and promised independence, and thus greater self-determination to the western counties of Virginia. If they would break away from the Virginia government controlled by the wealthier planters, although the process by which this happened was legally sketchy, the U.S. Supreme Court nonetheless put its stamp of approval on West Virginia secession in 1871. That's in the Reconstruction Act. There is no particular reason why Virginia secessionists would need to join West Virginia. Of course, it could make just as much sense to join Virginia counties to North Carolina, Tennessee, or Kentucky instead. Moreover, it is not even necessary that these seceding counties be contiguous with neighboring states. They can function perfectly fine as exclaves. Some practical considerations. There are practical obstacles to secession, to be sure. Businesses would be subject to different regulations, and the criminal code would be slightly different for county residents as the county switched to a new state. State budgets will have to be changed to reflect the new borders. Federal law, of course, will remain unchanged in all areas. And matter of global diplomacy will be virtually unaffected. Congress's involvement need not extend much beyond of apportioning the members of Congress once the next decennial census comes along. Unfortunately, status quo bias will cause many to emotionally reject any change. The way things have always been done will be trotted out as justification for keeping things as they are, essentially forever. Secession, a moral imperative. But is there a moral argument against secession from Virginia? Not if we take ideas of self-determination and human rights seriously. If minority groups find themselves perennially in the minority, what recourse do they have if the boundaries are also permanently fixed? Some might suggest these people can move across state lines, but since state lines can be hundreds of miles away in a large state like Virginia, a forced diaspora would likely require a minority population to expand their communities. Some suggest members of the minority ought to trust the court system to protect their rights. But American history is littered with the Supreme Court decision which the court ever either refused to take action or explicitly side with governments against the rights of citizens. Examples are numerous. U.S. Court, for an example, endorsed the internment of U.S. citizens of Japanese descent. You can add German and Italians as well. Federal courts failed to intervene to preserve the property rights of the Mexican Americans in accordance with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Federal courts have failed to intervene when California banned the ownership of property by Japanese Americans. Federal courts have approved obviously unconstitutional provisions of the USA Patriot Act. Federal courts failed to uphold provisions of U.S. treaties with Indian tribes when the U.S. government illegally and unilaterally abrogated those treaties. Courts, of course, also reversed themselves on major issues. Courts abandoned the idea that government can't void private contracts with the end of the Lochner era. Courts made the idea that a right of privacy means matter of abortion, considered to be a state and local matter for 190 years, will suddenly be regulated by federal law. Placing trust in the courts is a fanciful idea at best. Even if court decisions goes the minority's way in the short term, there's no finding a majority in the long term. After all, judges are not immune from the current ideological change as imposed by majority groups. A law school they control. Thus, as economist and social theorist Ludwig von Mises noted in his book, 1927 book, Liberalism, when a member of the minority appears before a magistrate or any administrative official as a party to suit or petition, he stands before men whose political thought is foreign to him because it developed under different ideological influences. At every turn, the member of a national minority is to made feel that he lives among strangers and that he is, even if the letter of the law denies it, a second-class citizen. Writing in the decades following the First World War, when national boundaries were being redrawn along ethnic lines, Mises was acutely aware of the problems that presented minority communities who found themselves in larger jurisdictions controlled by groups who differed in their backgrounds and ideologies. When it came to protecting their rights, minority groups could not simply place their trust in the next election or in the hands of government judges and hope for the best. Often the most peaceful and reliable strategy was to redraw borders so that minority communities might ally with other sympathetic groups. Mises continues, the right of self-determination in regard to the question of membership in the state thus means whenever the inhabitants of a particular theory, whenever it be a single village, a whole district, or a series of adjacent districts, make it known by a freely conducted plebiscite they no longer wish to remain united to the state to which they belong at the time, but wish either to form an independent state or to attach themselves to some other state. Their wishes are to be respected and complied with. This is only feasible and effective way of preventing revolutions and civil and international wars. Mises recognized that over time, populations and ideologies change in various times and places. People migrate and culture changes. Majorities can be turned into minorities and vice versa. This Mises recognized, nonetheless, does not render the legal and property rights of the minority groups null and void. Communities are still entitled to the right of self-determination even when in the minority. Strategies must therefore adapt it to protect these minority groups. One of those practical strategies Mises understood was changing borders of political jurisdictions to fit the realities of populations within those borders. As Mises noted, to force members of conflicting groups to live side by side within a single jurisdiction is problematic, to say at least. It only encourages each side to become ever more fanatical in its drive to gain control of the machinery of government so as to oppress the other side. This is why Mises presented his plan as a means of avoiding violence. Increasingly intense competition over centralized institutions of political power tends to lead violence in the long term. The answer lies in decentralization and secession. Conversely, the potential for violence is minimized by the minimizing state powers. In the presence of a mostly laissez-faire government, neither side has much reason to worry about who controls the state, but the stakes climb ever higher as the state gains more power over people's lives. But minimizing the state power certainly isn't what is going on in Virginia right now. Anything in that state is moving very much in the opposite direction. Imprudent, a flexible political system, those parts in the state dominated by now the out-of-power groups will be permitted to join themselves to regimes more in line with their cultures and ideological views. But we don't live in a prudent and flexible political system. We live in a system where the dictates of democracy are such that whichever group finds itself in the minority must submit to the elect ruling regime, or else no other option is permitted. It is the road that often leads to violence by either private parties or by the regime against the people. Interesting there indeed. Little history lesson in this article too. So I always like to share that with all my listeners. And this is why you should always focus on your state constitution. And I've always been stressing that. Especially when it comes to Declaration or Bill of Rights. That's the supreme law of your state. People say, oh, well, look, the U.S. Constitution, yeah, that's part of it too, don't get me wrong. But you can't use that as a corporate doctrine. You should always focus on the state level because it's mainly in line with the U.S. Constitutional U.S. Bill of Rights, which actually, if you read, I did a show on Annie Fellows Papers 84 by a gentleman named, had a pen name called Brutus, said it did one called a lack of Bill of Rights at the federal level. So it's good to always know know this information, and you can comprehend and enhance it and implement. So that was a pretty wise decision what West Virginia did. The Senate approved, like Federal County want to go with them. As long as the people in that county know about their state's Bill of Rights and their tax system, etc. But you go focus on the state's constitution and take it from there. Because I know for a fact that farming there is pretty lenient. And keeping bear arms is a natural right. A lot of natural rights. And don't get me wrong, that state has its issues. I remember I read an article like last year when they did an impeachment on the Supreme Court justices in that state. That's right. Wow. But vigilance is the key, folks. And that's why I always tell people, your rights are natural born. The government can think they can alter it and change you. No. You can change. You could give them a taste of their own medicine and it's more legit. So always honor your natural rights with no exceptions, as long as you don't violate others. So I don't want to hear any, oh, well, you know, how about we do it? I'm like, I don't want to hear that. People don't know me well enough, as long as you don't violate others. All right, well, this one here came from the conservative CNSnews.com. And this was written by Chuck Muth. Hopefully I pronounced his name correctly. Came out yesterday, and he's the president of Citizen Outreach. It says here, tobacco minimum age law should raise a red flag for states' rights supporters. As it reads here, new law will raise the minimum wage to buy tobacco to 21. The legislation will enforce a new age limit across the United States, including both for normal cigarettes and newly popular e-cigarettes. Some have heralded the law as a victory for children's health, but there is much more sinister aspect of the bill no one seems to be talking about. The legislation is yet another nail in the coffin for the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution outlining the Bill of Rights served as the fundamental function in America. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor be prohibited to the states. The Founding Fathers decreed are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Everyone in Congress is aware of the 10th Amendment's existence. Some just choose to selectively ignore it, of course, because they're lawyers. They know more than us. Please. Many of them in there. I can't say all. They seek to legislate their personal values into the law books, and the long arm of the federal government is the easiest tool at their disposal. Could we say overreach, encroachment? But what our elected representatives seemingly fail to understand is that turning blind eyes to the 10th Amendment is dangerous. When the votes are there, the president of doing so can easily be used against them. In fact, some in the gambling community are already trying to seize upon the recent anti-federalism activity by ramming two bills through Congress. The first piece of legislation is Senate Bill 1368, also known as the Lumbee Recognition Act, sponsored by North Carolina Senators Richard Burr and Tom Tillis. A bill will grant land in Robeson County, North Carolina, into a group known as the Lumbees, which may be used to build an off-reservation casino for Class 2 or Class 3 gaming. So how does that supersede states' rights? It doesn't. Well, the states themselves are supposed to choose whether they become home to new gambling houses. This bill will circumvent federalism by granting Lumbees federal recognition as Native Americans, which could allow them to build a casino. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, not Congress, is supposed to decide which groups qualify for federal recognition. However, with this bill, Burr and Tillis are trying to short-circuit the regular process, likely because the BIA has expressed skepticism over the Lumbees' claims, in large part because they've changed their tribal affiliation 4 times over the year. Can we see a Muck Productions? No federal recognition would mean no off-reservation casino, but the Lumbee Recognition Act would give this group with questionable Native American roots the former while putting them on a 5-yard line on the ladder. The bill is nothing more than Congress trying to bend the rules to create a 10th Amendment loophole. It may help gambling lobby quickly create an off-reservation casino, but it will do so at the expense of states' rights. Can we say the case of Prince versus the United States ring a bell? That includes Federalist Papers 46, written by James Madison. The second anti-federalism bill is Senate Bill 790, a piece of legislation yet again sponsored by the usual suspect senators Tillis and Burr. If elected, it will give the Catawba Indian tribe of South Carolina the right to build a casino in North Carolina. The text of the bill lays plain the federal government's assault on the 10th Amendment principle of state sovereignty. Most notably, it would explicitly suspend Section 20 of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which, through effectively granting the governor veto power, gives the people of the state say over the building of the casino. The reason for the bill's suspension of Section 20 is obvious. When the Catawba first proposed the idea in North Carolina, they were unsuccessful at convincing the people of North Carolina. Following in S790's footsteps, it appeared that Tillis and Burr introduced the bill for no reason other than to take the power away from their home state government. They have likely done so to please the casino's developers, who has contributed handsomely to both of their political campaigns. Ain't that great? Campaign contributions are nothing more than bribes. All this gaming could be coming to North Carolina, despite North Carolinians clearly not wanting the casino built. Why? Because politicians' recent momentum is taking the 2x4 to the 10th Amendment itself. Whatever is through tobacco or gaming regulations, flouting the Constitution to advance political agendas can spiral out of control and seriously backfire. The federal government's actions are too broad and the resulting unintended consequences too severe. Hopefully, Senators Tillis and Burr, along with the rest of their colleagues in Congress, back off and come to recognize that nothing good can come from doing against the document they pledged to uphold, defend, and protect over the long term. Doing so will only breed future pathways to assault federalism that no one ever realized were possible. I can't argue with that. He's absolutely correct. More of federal intervention, government knows best. It happened with the alcohol as well. 21 and over, which I do find a 10th Amendment conflict. But it's okay. It will keep us safe, protect our kids. It doesn't do anything. That's why I'm against these feds know best. Stick to the Constitution, folks. Plain and simple. I can see you have the state of South Carolina do a 10th Amendment resolution on this. I think 10th Amendment said we're back on that one for sure. But bottom line, read Federalist Papers 46 by James Madison. Interesting stuff. And even it's stuff in the Federalist Papers as well. Wow. Alright, that is it. I thank everyone for listening. Plus, feel free to download and share us throughout your social media networks. If you have any questions, comments, or if something interesting you want to check out, whatever you do, please address your correspondence with decorum. I shall leave all the footnotes of these articles I've narrated on my Spreaker page. Once again, thank you for your time. Plus, always remember that demoniac resistance is healthy for the soul and can liberate humanity. Till next time, take care of yourselves. Keep on spreading love, and may your guardian spirits be with you.